Dear students, first we have to understand what is the history of the evolution of peacekeeping. At the very outset, we can describe that peacekeeping is not a war-fighting institution of the United Nations. Though at no point the term peacekeeping is mentioned within the UN Charter, it has developed as a tool of United Nations collective security system. It is part of the collective security system. United Nations is the organization which we describe as a collective security organization. The development of the institution of peacekeeping, dear students, represents a remarkable example of the evolution of the collective security system. The blue helmet, which the peacekeepers actually put on their heads, that has become the symbol, a symbol of hope to millions of people around the world. There is a definitional problem. The definitional issue is that the difficulty that peacekeeping is not an easy thing to be defined in a general way. The problem of definition, the difficulty in defining peacekeeping lies in the fact that it is a concept which has evolved actually in both political and legal terms in response to the changing circumstances rather than finding its creation in an expression, finding its creation in an express provision of legal document such as the United Nations Charter. Legally speaking, no provision of the United Nations explicitly deals with peacekeeping. As a result, there is no universally agreed definition of what it actually encompasses, and at different stages in its evolution, it has arguably meant different things. Peacekeeping has evolved as a tool, as a mechanism, as an instrument to serve the cause of the peace. To serve the cause of peace, the first and the foremost purpose of the United Nations. It was not created as any other structure of the United Nations, like UN Security Council, like General Assembly. It has evolved itself, undergoing through different stages of development pertaining to the nature of operations. The peacekeeping operations determine the meaning of what it stands for. As I said that the peacekeeping has evolved, it has evolved, dear students, through 4 different stages of development, through 4 stages of generation of operations. Each of the stage has been characterized by particular features in relation to the role which operations have performed and the principle by which they have been governed. The emergence of each new generation of peacekeeping operations marked a conceptual development in the status of peacekeeping and posed new legal and political challenges for the United Nations. First generation peacekeeping. First generation peacekeeping, we can say it is limited to limited functions. The functions of the first stage peacekeeping operations were largely limited to the monitoring of ceasefire agreements and patrolling of demarcated boundaries between the parties involved into dispute. Their role was essentially restricted to literally keeping the peace. Keeping what? Peace, which was there. Which was there means that the parties in dispute, they had agreed for the resolution of the conflict, and they desired a neutral participants to restore order, to restore what they want, to establish what the parties in the dispute actually wanted. So the UN mandated to keep what was there. This served as a general template, as a general framework for subsequent operations during this first generation of peacekeeping. The three principles in first generation were central to the peacekeeping operations. Peacekeeping was considered as a mechanism distinct from enforcement action. It was not enforcement action under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. They focus on three things. One, consent of the parties. It was must. Second, impartiality of the peacekeepers. And third, no use of force permissible only under self-defense. The first generation peacekeeping forces were only deployed with the consent of the parties to the dispute, and they were tasked to assist in the settlement of the issue of dispute. Secondly, peacekeepers were to remain impartial in the performance of their mandate, the duty which was assigned to them. They had to limit their role only to that duty. Finally, the peacekeepers were not to use force other than in self-defense. Gradually, this principle became relaxed as great powers' cooperation increased and the nature of threats also changed. This was arguably facilitated by the limited mandates conferred upon peacekeepers, which essentially involved them for the most part supervising ceasefire agreements, serving as buffer forces, and supervising the withdrawal of troops, permitted to use force only in self-defense. From this stage in 1980s, there was the second generation peacekeeping. It evolved. In second generation peacekeeping, we see that the expansion of the functions. With the great power, political disagreement reduced from the late 1980s onwards. A second generation of peacekeeping operations began to emerge, assuming a broader range of functions than the first generation. At the very time, the UN broadened conception of security, in which threats to peace were increasingly found to exist due to situations internal in states, found it faced with a number of intra-state conflicts or situations in which conflict had recently ended and some form of intervention was called for in order to build a lasting peace. On the subject of second generation peacekeeping, one scholar, Gray, described that the change that most post-Cold War peacekeeping operations have been deployed in response to civil war situations to support efforts to achieve their peaceful settlements and or maintain ceasefires. Consequently, international intervention has had to go beyond the merit of earlier operations in order to assist in bringing about national reconciliation and re-establishing effective government. As a consequence, as a result, peacekeeping operations became more numerous and complex, involving a wider set of political, military, and humanitarian tasks. The second generation of peacekeeping commenced with the deployment of operations of the kind dispatched to Namibia, Central America, El Salvador, and Cambodia. They actually set the tone of the second generation peacekeeping. Peacekeeping operations of the second generations were tasked with the mandates which gave them a more direct role in the implementation of the peace process and ceasefire agreements. Their functions included the supervision of free elections, human rights monitoring, supervision of disarmament and the verification of the parties' compliance of obligations, law and order situations, electoral monitoring of the elections under the peacekeeping mandates. All of the peacekeeping activities between 1987 and 1991 remained firmly predicated on the principle of consent, minimum use of force, and impartiality. This became the defining feature of peacekeeping when actually the peacekeeping tool was invented and it evolved, it progressed. So this framework, these conditions remained continued in the second generation peacekeeping operations. None of these operations, this is what is very important here to mention, dear students, that none of these operations were created by reference to the Chapter 7 of the United States Charter. This relates to the validity of the legality of the peacekeeping operations. Peacekeeping operations of the third generations, they moved towards where it appeared that they become militarized, more like enforcement actions by the United Nations. Though we are not completely enforcement actions, but this element was made ingredient part of the third generation peacekeeping operations. The peacekeeping operations in third generation, the benefit for the peacekeepers was of working in an environment where the parties to the disputes were largely committed to the peaceful resolution of the conflicts. In 1990s, a new breed of conflicts emerged, in 1990s, the new breed of conflict emerged for which it proved impractical for peacekeepers to fulfill their mandates in accordance with the established principles of traditional peacekeeping. Therefore, the third generation peacekeeping became embroiled in the controversy as peacekeepers were deployed in an environment where there was simply no peace to keep, and where the existence of consent to their presence on part of some of the parties to the conflict was questionable and or simply non-existent. This led to the third generation of peacekeeping in which operations were entrusted with mandates which crossed the boundaries into military enforcement. The peacekeeping operations of Somalia and former Yugoslavia illustrate the situation quite well. Here we see that peacekeeping operations and the enforcement operations, this distinguishing line blurred. We see that at third generation of peacekeeping development, the traditional principle applicable to the peacekeeping have undergone some form of evolution through the incorporation of residual authority into peacekeeping mandates to permit the recourse to the use of force where the distinction between peacekeeping and enforcement appeared to become blurred. So, this is the defining feature of the third generation peacekeeping, where in some cases the consent was not there or it was questionable, and the mandates given were to use force if essential. So, thereby minimizing the line of difference between the enforcement action and the peacekeeping actions. Fourth generation peacekeeping, they became more exclusive, more expensive. As we know that the third generation of peacekeeping, as we know that at the third generation of peacekeeping, we observed that the mandates were entrusted with more powers to further the key objectives of their missions. At fourth stage, we observe the evolution from peacekeeping to peace building towards larger responsibility in terms of sustainability of peace. This involves not only the performance of a more direct role in peace building process, but also taking responsibility for certain functions that are ordinarily the preserve of the state. While elements of such governing a nation the role of United Nations operation in the administration of civil authority became firmly established into two operations. The United Nations Transnational Administration in East Timor and the United Nations Interim Administration Mission in Kosovo. Both these missions were created in 1999. These two operations, it is said that represents the crossover to the comprehensive governance of a state for ensuring the long-term peace. So, at the development of fourth generation of peacekeeping, the peace operations actually became more related to the role which was supposed to be the role of the state. They are supposed to serve that purpose. So because of the failure, because of the weakness, because of the inability, the peacekeepers were assigned this duty to take up the responsibility of governing so that the peace, the lasting peace, the genuine peace can be restored, can be established. The development in peacekeeping represented by UN operation in East Timor and Kosovo, dear student, reflect the broadened conception of collective security. What we see here, that these two incidents of peacekeeping, they broaden the conception of the collective security. The successful management of conflict involves efforts which range from preventive diplomacy before threats to international peace and security fully militarized to support the peace building measures in the aftermath of conflict, etc. They all became the they all became the subject of fourth generation peacekeeping operations. So at this stage, we see that more and more role is played in transformative peace building processes. Peacekeeping evolved through four stages. And today, it is still is a issue which we cannot define as acceptable to everyone, to all. So, peacekeeping, dear students, in the present context, we can say the peacekeeping is a term which we cannot define with any degree of precision, as will become apparent from my invocation here, from my talk to you, that the concept of peacekeeping, broadly understood, represents an attempt by the United Nations to develop a mechanism through which it is able to support efforts aimed at the creation or maintenance of peace, or at the very least conflict avoidance through the deployment of the traditionally non-combatant forces on the ground to undertake a variety of functions. This does not cover the entirety of the peacekeeping, which actually it has become in the present days. This is something what we see that the United Nations is engaged with. Most of its activities which relate to peace and security, they pertain to peacekeeping operations. So this is the subject not only before the United Nations, which is of significance, it is of importance for the whole world community, because we see more and more conflicts are of internal nature. They happen within the territories of the states, either supported or not supported by the outside states. But the fact is that we see that the interstate conflicts are very rare. Intra-state conflicts are much, and they are progressing. They are many. So, developed as a tool of collective security system, peacekeeping, despite its military dimension, still remains more closely aligned with peaceful settlement than the sanctions and enforcement options under the Chapter 7. It is not exclusively a collective security enforcement action, which the UN Charter actually provides that That could be decided under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter by the Security Council. One scholar, Sambaris, a scholar of renounce, he attempts to encapsulate the modern nature of peacekeeping, suggesting that today peacekeeping is the multi-dimensional management of complex peace operations, usually in post-Civil War context, designed to provide interim security and assist parties to make those transformations that are essential to make a peace sustainable. This is a picture which is given by Sambres. It covers the comprehensiveness of the peacekeeping operation, which we can associate with this idea of peacekeeping. But the peacekeeping today, my dear students, comprises of activities intended to create conditions that favor lasting peace. Anything that contributes to peace with the meaning of peace, anything that contributes to peace falls within the meaning of peacekeeping. The boundaries between conflict prevention, peace building, peacemaking, peace enforcement have become blurred and mutually reinforcing, overlapping between themselves, actually is in practice. So, it has become an all-encompassing activity on the part of United Nations, where the actions of United Nations which serve the purpose of peace and security, they comprise the peacekeeping. Peace operations, my dear students, are rarely limited to one type of activity. It becomes inclusive to include any activity undertaken by the United Nations for the furthering of cause of peace. However, state consent, non-use of force, and impartiality remain the defining principles of peacekeeping operations. The defining features which were actually laid down at the first stage of peacekeeping evolution, development, the conceptualization of which was that peacekeeping consists of three things: consent of the parties involved in dispute. Second, no use of force, only permissible in self-defense. And overall, the impartiality of the peacekeepers, the impartiality of the United Nations serving the cause of peace and security. This development actually is the development which has contributed to peacekeeping, not necessarily under Chapter 7, where the collective security system, which involves enforcement actions. And that system, that collective security, as we know, that was actually used 2 times under Chapter 7, and collective securities under Chapter 7 was not a very successful action on the part of the United Nations. But the peacekeeping is the development, is a tool which the United Nations has used and which furthers the cause of collective security, not using the Charter of the United Nations, using the implied meaning, my dear students, drawing the implied meanings from the Charter of the United Nations. It has established a system which is more acceptable, more successful, though not without problems, though not without criticism. So for today, this is all. Thank you.